When I was young, 6 or 7, my family and I went on vacation to Morocco. It was a very nice place. We visited a lot of different towns, and we even went to the beach to swim and have a nice beach day. In total, we stayed for about 3 weeks. One of the weeks, we had planned to rent a 4x4, go into the desert to explore, and go to towns and resorts, etc. So the first day of our desert expedition, we woke up early, got the 4x4, and drove off into the desert. We would stop every 30 minutes or so to walk around a bit, play in the sand, and take in the beauty. It was a very fun day. That night, we stayed in a hotel so we could leave early and do more exploring. The next day, we were driving along like normal when my parents wanted to stop for lunch in the middle of the desert. We had a lot of food in our car. My brothers and I were happy to have some time to go out and play. We had our lunch, packed up, and just when we were about to leave, we realized we were stuck. The 4x4 wouldn't move. It had sunk into the sand. We were stuck there for about 5 hours. My family didn't seem to care much, but I was freaking out. I was crying and yelling for help. I thought we were going to die, even though we had enough food for days. Then, just when my parents were starting to get a bit stressed, we saw a car in the distance. It was coming towards us. We were saved. The men from the car helped us get our car out of the sand, and they even offered to take us to an inn that belonged to their friend. We were so grateful. They drove us in their truck, towing our car for a few hours until we arrived at this inn in the desert. It was a very nice place with traditional walls and beautiful scenery. My brothers and I went outside on a little sand dune to play in the sand while my parents talked to the men. They helped us make sure our car was running normally, and were very nice and hospitable. I was playing outside when I got a bit cold. It was around 7 p.m, so I went back inside to get a sweater. Upon entering, I saw my dad hiding around a corner, listening to the men talking to each other in Arabic. A bit strange, but I didn't think anything was up, so I went to get my sweater and went back outside. Night came and we went to bed. I was in a room with my mum and my brothers were in the next room with my dad. It was around 2 a.m. when my mum woke me up and told me to get dressed because she wanted to go on a little walk, so we left the room. But then she guided me outside and towards our car, where my brothers and dad were already inside. We drove away and we never went back. I didn't understand why, and I assumed we were just driving around. We spent the rest of the vacation in towns. I didn't know at the time, but my parents just told me the full story. My dad had overheard the men talking about how someone would come pick us up in the morning. My dad discussed this with my mum, and that's when they hatched the middle of the night getaway plan. When my mum was waiting in bed, pretending to sleep, she saw a man with a knife sneak into our room and hide in our closet. Not long ago, my partner and I were driving through reservation land at about 11 o'clock at night, in the desert, southwest of the USA. We were on a major highway, but as with so many highways in that area, it's not very well used, just barely paved and with only one lane going in each direction. No lights, just reflectors embedded in the pavement. It's not uncommon to go for an hour on this highway without seeing another vehicle. I was reading a book aloud when suddenly, my buddy who was driving interrupts and pulls off on the side of the road, braking quickly. "Did you see that?" "No," I replied. "See what?" "That van, it went off the road." I turned in my seat, but couldn't make out anything on or off the road. It was just darkness all around. He grabbed the flashlight that we keep in the car and asked me to call 911. He's in a medical profession and a lapsed licensed EMT, and I've worked in emergency response. so this isn't a super uncommon occurrence for us. Although not even being able to see the accident was a first for me. I got on the phone with 911 immediately and set about trying to find a mile marker using my phone as a flashlight, eventually settling for giving them approximate GPS coordinates, as I had very little coverage and my GPS was acting flighty in that area. The dispatcher asked me to cross the highway carefully and try to ascertain the status of the passengers. Since they had gone straight over a hill and presumably into the canyon below, I stayed on the line while I trudged over the sand dunes on the opposite side of the highway. I was a bit nervous to be walking this area in sandals, as we had just recently been discussing the rattlesnake population in the region, and I couldn't really see where I was going and answer the dispatcher questions at the same time. But the scrubby vegetation gave me some purchase, and finally, I crested the largest dune and could see the outline of the accident site. On the road, the moonlight was blocked by the dunes, but on this side, it was strangely bright. It took my brain a moment to make sense of what I was seeing. They had been lucky. The van had turned on its side as it slid, and the friction from the dunes had just barely prevented the entire thing from going over the edge into the massive canyon below. My partner called out to me and asked me to check on the woman in the van, and I saw that next to him, standing, with a scarecrow-like stiffness, was a young man. He looked dazed and didn't seem to be answering many questions. I got the darkest vibe off that guy that I've ever encountered. I felt goosebumps crawling up my back, and it was just like there was a permanent ring of shadow around him. I felt very uneasy knowing that either of us were anywhere near him, and made a point to keep visually checking up on them. I proceeded to the site and around the van, and called out to identify myself. I heard the voice of a woman inside, and as I walked around the windshield, I could see her. She was crouched in the passenger cabin, clearly in shock, her feet bleeding as she shifted back and forth in the broken glass of the driver's side window. A tall, willowy woman, thin and pale, with dark hair. There was also a massive wolfhound, panting. It appeared equally stunned. I saw that they had managed to pry the passenger side door open, and the man must have climbed out through the top that way. The woman spoke with me for a time, calmly, and with an urgency I couldn't quite identify in her voice, and I relayed the information to the dispatcher. Yes, it was just the two of them. No, they don't seem to be seriously injured. No, nobody had fallen asleep at the wheel. They were on their way to Texas to visit family. They were living out of the van. What I remember most clearly is that I made a couple of attempts to convince her to either climb out of the roof or through the back to clear away from the van just to be safe, but she politely refused each time. She said that she didn't want to leave the dog. There was something just wrong about her demeanour. People react differently to stress, and she seemed alert and competent, so I put it to the back of my mind. But I kept being struck by a strangeness in her handling of the situation. Dispatcher and I agreed that the paramedics could probably easily break the windshield to free them, and there was no sign of fuel, so it was fine for her to stay in there until they arrived. Once I double-checked that she was secure and wasn't going to go anywhere, I handed off the phone to my partner while I went out to wave in the paramedics, who had accidentally passed the site and were backing towards us from further up the highway, looking for our flashlight thanks to the dispatcher. They pulled off a ways up from the site, and I began to brief them when we all heard dispatch come over the radio.
Please be advised that the male passenger is AMS and considered dangerous.
AMS stands for altered mental status, suggesting that someone isn't in the normal frame of mind for any of a variety of reasons. We all stopped in our tracks. The paramedics exchanged a glance, and one went back to the ambulance for additional equipment. I was eager to get back to my partner to make sure he hadn't communicated that to dispatch out of concern for his safety. But when we arrived on site, they were still talking quietly. I went to my car to find shoes for the woman. The passengers were placed in different ambulances, and the police arrived to take interviews all around. Just as we were about to leave, an officer taking our statements turned to us and said, "It's real messed up. I guess she was driving and he wanted to kill them both. So he grabbed the wheel and overpowered her. It's lucky either of them are alive." After a couple of hours, when we were back to driving, my partner proceeded to fill in the details. When he first got to the scene, the woman was yelling that he had tried to kill her and not to leave her alone with him. She also said that if he got out, he needed to be restrained as he was a danger to himself and others. The man was very eager to get out of the vehicle. Bewildered, my partner had nonetheless helped the guy pry the door open, and once he was out, the guy had just clammed up and wouldn't do much more than nod or shake his head in response to questions. He kept thinking that the guy might take off and get lost in a desert, but in the end, he had waited. He said the guy seemed agitated, so he was doing his best to keep him engaged and distracted until help could arrive. It was chilling to realize that what we had thought was an accident was actually a murder-suicide attempt. I really wanted to accompany the woman to the hospital, but for unrelated reasons, we couldn't remain. We went back that way during the day on our return trip a week later. We pulled over at the site and climbed over the dunes to see whether they had managed to tow the van over all of that sand, and sure enough, it was gone. What was unnerving was the realization, upon seeing the landscape during the day, that if he had chosen any other spot to grab the wheel, for miles in both directions, they would have been over a cliff almost immediately. In the dark, there was no way for him to tell, but he had chosen the only spot where they realistically could have survived the accident. My partner then told me that they had gone off the road when they were nearly opposite our little sedan on the highway. If the guy had opted for a head-on collision instead of the off-the-cliff option, we would have been toast. It was a sobering thought. I think of the woman I met that night often, and of her wolfhound being gingerly coaxed into the back of a police car. I really hope that they are in a much better place now. As for that guy who tried to kill them all, I certainly hope that he gets help, and that we never have cause to meet again.